And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Thanks for tuning into the podcast once again. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and as many schools are reverting back to virtual learning, not in-person learning around the world, I wanted to remind you that our workshops are available in an online format in almost all cases. We certainly look forward to resuming on-site workshops, hopefully in the spring as we emerge from this COVID pandemic. But in the event that you are looking for help with teaching and learning, either with project-based learning or inquiry or other areas in which we specialize, or our effective online teaching workshop, which of course is held online, please feel free to reach out or to contact us through our website, wegrowteachers.com. And if you are looking for on-site workshops in the spring, we are scheduling those starting in the spring and summer if you want to reach out through the website as well. One last note, I did want to make sure that folks were aware of our Asynchronous Pbl on-demand video courses that can be purchased for individuals who might be interested in our PBL workshops but are part of a school that is not engaging in group workshops. And that can be found by going to wegrowteachers.com/PBL on demand. In this episode, I spoke with Chad Dumas, who is the author of a new book called Let's Put the C in PLC, a practical guide for school leaders. So as you might imagine, we talked a lot about professional learning communities, how to do them well, and some of the things you may not want to do, and the role of charisma and leadership. And that touched on an interesting conversation about cognitive conflict versus affective conflict that I thought was interesting. We talked about some of the principles and ways to think about adult learning, and especially in the context of leadership, as well as many other pieces around doing PLCs well, and just really collaboration and leadership, and ended up talking about some of the nuts and bolts of the characteristics of effective teams and teaming. So I am a big believer in doing PLCs well and not doing them poorly, as many pieces in education, leadership, and collaboration can go wrong and have a negative outcome and at least a negative sentiment attached to it. So it's incumbent upon leaders and educators to do it well for the educators they're working with, but of course the students that we are working with and the benefits to them. So hopefully this is a useful conversation and you enjoy it. Chad, welcome to the podcast. As I usually like to do, I like to give our guests an opportunity to introduce themselves and give a little context of who our listeners are listening to, so they have a better idea of what we're talking about. So go ahead and give us a little background on yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to engage with you and share a little bit with your listeners. So I started my career as a vocal music teacher in Lincoln Public Schools as a middle school teacher, and then was an intermediate service agency professional developer where I got to work with lots of schools and districts ranging from schools with 80 kids in the whole district to 10,000 kids in the district. Then was a secondary principal and then a director of learning in a high poverty, high diversity district in south central Nebraska, where I was able to really take the ideas of what I had learned through my dissertation work and the work of PLCs and really help move the district forward in improving student learning. And where we work together as a team to overcome significant barriers and challenges as we know exist, kids coming from poverty and second and third and fourth language homes, and helping to overcome that. And then recently decided that I would put that learning into a work that maybe would help others around the country and world. And so I wrote the book called Let's Put the C in PLC, which takes the ideas from my dissertation, which identify 10 elements of knowledge that school leaders need to know to be able to build collaborative environments for teachers, And then so took that dissertation knowledge and then my practical experience and put it together. And so that's what the book and my work really hones in on, is how do we know from like 50 years of research that if we want to improve student learning, a pretty surefire way to do it is to create a culture and an environment where teachers are working together to improve their own practice in student learning.
Okay, and if folks are not familiar with PLCs, the C is community, or at least as I understand it.
Yes.
And it's an interesting, one of the things that I think is interesting about the PLCs, and we can get into this, I'm sure, as we kind of talk through some of the pieces, but having been a teacher for 15 years myself and engaging in professional development and collaborative planning and all or many of the iterations of that as a teacher might, we at one point did PLCs, and I don't know if you're familiar or had listened to or got a chance to or noticed that I had talked with Richard DeFore, who of course is one of the forefathers or really important names in PLCs, and his last book before he passed away, In Praise of American Educators, of which I'm a huge fan, and we talked long enough. I split it into two, and that was 3 or 4 years ago, I'd say, maybe 3 years ago, and I really like that book. So the idea, one of the questions I asked him, of course, was how do we sort of make PLCs work and not become what tends to be, or at least in my experience, and I sometimes jokingly say this, but it feels like, how long is this going to take, and what do we have to turn in, and not really, particularly useful in sort of the culture of those collaborative conversations. So you say you have 10 elements. I'm assuming the book you said is focused on or pulls from your dissertation of the 10 elements of knowledge there.
Yep.
What's the elevator pitch for those 10 elements as they were?
Yeah. So before I share just a little bit about the 10, I do want to just reaffirm what you just said. And that is, and actually there's been some studies done recently. I heard Peter DeWitt a couple of weeks ago say that the most hated term in education right now is PLC. And I think that's because of what you just talk about, is that
that's
it's
some stiff competition for buzzwords in education.
This is true. Yes, there's a lot of them. So that's where my thinking around, let's put the community back in professional learning community. Let's make sure it's there. And so what these 10 elements, the result of the work was, so I was working on my dissertation and I was sharing with my wife, as many of us who have spouses do. And I was telling her about how, we know that collaboration works. We also know that it's not happening in most schools, that, there's, I go in and I shut my door and I do my thing. And, we're friendly, we're collegial, we talk to each other in the hallways and see each other in the lunchrooms, but meaningful collaboration where we're actually talking about and observing each other teach and thinking about and planning instruction together doesn't happen a lot. And so I was sharing with my wife this idea of, so we know it works, but we're not doing it. Like that good old fashioned knowing doing gap. I know that I need to exercise 30 minutes a day, but I don't do it. And so I was sharing with her this knowing doing gap, and she kept asking me over and over again, probably 6 or 7 times, well, Chad, how do you know that people know what they need to do? And I just kind of would blow her off and say, well, of course people know, principals have been teachers themselves and they've got master's degrees, and of course they know. And she kept saying, well, how do you know? And after 6 or 7 times of her asking me this, it finally dawned on me that maybe we don't know what we need to do, that maybe we need to clearly say, this is what we need to know. And so I then started combing the literature and found out that, as you mentioned, Rick DeFore, he's got specific processes. And Learning Forward talks about standards of professional learning. And Todd Whitaker has great stuff around leadership. All these folks have their little niches, but nobody had said, look, building principal, school leaders, if you want to build a collaborative environment, this is what you need to know. And so that's what I did then. As I none of this is really my original work. It's pulling from all these different ideas. These are the 10 things that you need to know to build a collaborative environment for teachers, for educators, to improve our practice and improve results for kids.
Okay. So with the 10 elements, and so does the book then use those 10, or I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but
Yep.
how does it draw upon those 10 elements, or what are some of those?
So yeah, it's actually organized around the 10 elements, and then there's an 11th chapter as a call to action, because knowing isn't enough. We also have to do. And so each chapter is one of those elements. And so each chapter just shares a little bit about like what's the research on this, very briefly, 2, 3, 4 pages. It's not a dissertation. It's a tool. It's a guide to help people do this work. And then it shares stories, like what does it actually look like in practice? Each chapter has a checklist for you to self-assess. I don't know this. I need to know more about this. I know enough about this that I can get by. I can teach others of this. I know that well. And then it has additional resources as well. So you've got the research, tools, stories, and additional links to additional texts, websites, etc., to help folks further their own knowledge and practice.
Okay, so one of the things that we like to do, and I like and appreciate the sort of the language of need to know, because we do a lot of work in project-based learning and inquiry, and I think one of the skills that adults that we need to develop in our students who will eventually become adults is that problem-solving skill of asking the right questions and saying, what do we need to know and learn and be able to do in order to solve this problem and to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a main focus of the work that we do, and try to model and do our professional development in those ways. One of the things then that is maybe a piece of that, or isn't maybe, definitely is a piece of the work that we do, is to try to say, all right, when we're talking about mission and purpose and then vision, part of that conversation often is, what do we want our sort of ideal graduates to look like? What are the traits and characteristics and attributes and things, if we're trying to think, all right, this is what we're trying to do. This is our product, right? This is what we're trying to create. So I'm curious, I know you have some thoughts about charisma and leaders' charisma, but what are when you say leadership qualities and attributes, what are some of those really key and important ones? Obviously charisma being one. I'm curious how you sort of frame that and talk about that, but what have you found are some of those big pieces that make for successful leaders? Or maybe the opposite question, if we do a Freire model of a non-example, what are some of the things that are not particularly helpful?
Right. Yeah, so you kind of hit on the first element that I've identified, is that we need to know that charismatic leadership does not equal long-term success, that you don't need to be this knight on shining armor that comes in and can woo people over to be successful. And actually, there's some pretty good research from the business world that would indicate that it's actually the antithesis of long-term success. That when you have people who are highly charismatic, you're going to get really good success for a very short period of time. And as soon as that person's gone, it fades out. And so we need to know that. And so if charismatic leadership isn't what works, then what does work? And so for long-term success, and what I hone in on is what Michael Fullan says so beautifully: relationships. We know with kids, relationships, I heard somebody once say, I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. And that plays out for students. It also plays out for adults. And so as leaders, and I use the term leader very loosely, I'm not talking just principal, I'm talking about anyone in the school building has the right and responsibility to serve as a leader in different ways and at different times. And so in order to be successful, we have to build relationships. And so how do you do that? And I hone in on two big key ideas. One is from Paulo Freire, where he talks about principles of effective dialogue. Paulo Freire was a activist in Brazil, I believe, in 60s, 70s. And he identifies these beautiful 6 principles of effective dialogue. Things like love. Do I really love the people I'm interacting with? Do I show humility? Do I have faith in others? Like, do I really believe that you want to do the best for kids? Do I have that faith in you? Do I trust that you're going to get better? These are these 6 principles of effective dialogue that he hones in on. And then, and those are like this context of who am I as a person in relation to others? And then the other second area that I hone in regarding relationships is, now, what are some specific skills and practices that we can employ to make that happen? And I call them the 3+1. Because numbers are always helpful for us to remember. And so the 3+1 is, the +1 is a culture or an environment of dialogue, which relates to Paulo Freire's work, but it's also, there's some specific behaviors that we can use to engage with others to be more effective in our dialogue. And then 3 specific behaviors of pausing, posing questions, and paraphrasing. And you mentioned, asking questions and listening first, So there's these specific behaviors around this idea of how do we build relationships with others through being in dialogue and then using these 3+1 behaviors.
So there's a few things that threads I'd like to pull on here, because the charisma and the sort of juxtaposition to sustainability is I think an interesting one, especially in the context of relationships. And I'm a big proponent of developing relationships, and I agree that we need to, it is very important that our educators, or if I'm a student and trying to learn from somebody, that I get a sense that they actually care about my success, and there's a trust there. But there's also a sort of wrinkle there that I find an interesting one. I actually was going back and forth just a short amount of tweets with a woman who's in higher education, but she grew up in my hometown, and we crossed paths back then and fairly recently, because we're both Michigan State grads. And she was reminiscing about one of our shared former teachers, and I thought about this because one of the things that I think people might mistake, and I'm wondering how this plays out, or how you've seen this play out in that charisma piece, the sort of likability piece, which is different from do they care about me. So I had a teacher in high school who I really didn't care for. Matter of fact, we used to argue a lot, and I mean it was a sort of a rocky relationship, shall we say. She was not well liked by the students. Had some physical characteristics that they might make fun of her, as high school students are wont to do, and all of that. But on the other hand, I found her class, especially in reflection, very valuable, and I do think that she cared about me, even as she was really putting the screws to me, and what I felt was being kind of a jerk, and I was probably being reciprocally a jerk as well. But I wonder, a couple of things about the charisma piece there, and I don't disagree that we often see sort of leadership on the national stage, or in smaller, like in a principal role, who is very charismatic and sort of has that for lack of a better term, sort of cult of personality that folks are really drawn and lead. But do they lack the ability or the detail of putting processes and things in place, systems and things in place that would endure beyond their tenure, which seems to me that would be one of the things that would allow for that charismatic leader to have that legacy endure. But is there, I don't know how much you think about this or have thought about it, but that sort of likability factor versus the charisma and the relationships, is there any research that you have, or have you thought much about or written about the sort of likability in that context?
Yeah. In terms of likability specifically, I think you're very right that there's a difference between being likable and being able to build relationships. And one of the things that I think about in this regard is the importance of engaging with others in cognitive conflict. as opposed to affective conflict, right? We want to engage in conflict of the mind, but not of the heart. Like, I don't want to be in conflict with a human being as a human being, but we do want to engage in conflict of our ideas. I heard someone once say that if there's 3 of us in a room and we all agree, 2 of us are unnecessary. And I think many times, we confuse having cognitive conflict with likability. And so these skills, the 3+1 specifically, are tools to be able to engage in cognitive conflict in ways that help us stay out of affective conflict. So, for example, the like I mentioned, posing questions, and paraphrasing. These are 3 tools that can help us engage in cognitive conflict. So we can still have disagreements, but we also can be in relationship with each other and hopefully also like each other as well as part of that. My experience is some of the people I've disagreed with most, if we were able to do it in ways that we were disagreeing without being disagreeable, as they say, those relationships become even more strengthened and better over time. And so for instance, these 3 Ps, I pause. Any of us can use that as a strategy that, when we start engaging with someone and we feel our blood pressure start to rise because we disagree, that we pause and take a minute and just breathe and think. 3 or 4 or 5 seconds can do wonders, not only for the blood pressure, but also for the prefrontal cortex of our brain, so that we can engage in actual thinking with someone and engaging in that relationship building with them. So a simple pause is very powerful. I'm just going to take a deep breath and think about it for a second. Like, that's a powerful strategy. And then the second P of paraphrasing, right? So I've taken a second to think. Now, instead of just responding, instead of listening to respond, I want to listen to understand. Stephen Covey, his first habit of highly effective people was seek first to understand, then to be understood. And that's a really important idea as a leader, as anyone, if we want to build relationships. Pausing, paraphrasing. So one of the things that you're concerned about is, or one of the things that you'd like to make sure that we're doing as a building is, so it's really important that so you're talking about 3 different issues here, 1, 2, 3, right? There's these different ways that I can paraphrase back, and I'm not agreeing with them. I'm just making sure that they understand that I understand. And if I don't understand, they have an opportunity to clarify it. So pausing, paraphrasing, and then the third strategy is posing questions or prompting. And typically in that order is the best, right? Like, first I pause, then I paraphrase to make sure I understand and they understand, and then posing a question. So if you were king for the day, what might be some steps that we could take to push this forward? Or, so you talked about the behavior of your kids in class in general. What specific examples might you be able to share, or what data can we look at over time? Or I prefer the term evidence over data. What evidence over the last week or 2 could help us look at this situation better, right? So I'm not judging. I'm asking genuine, reflective questions to help that person gain a better understanding of where they're coming from and what they're needing, as well as me. And my experience is that through using those 3 approaches, not only are relationships stronger, but actually likability goes up as well, even though we're engaging in this cognitive conflict.
Yeah, well, the cognitive conflict, and I like that terminology. I don't know if I've heard that. I am a big fan and proponent of, and try to model it here on the podcast in some of the especially more contentious topics that are sort of in the media forefront and what have you. But one of the things that I am deeply concerned about is our ability or inability to have really difficult conversations. And of course, this has been written about and talked about a bit as well. I've had Jonathan Haidt on the podcast in his book, Coddling the American Mind, for folks who are interested in sort of the fragility kind of pieces of maybe how we have set people up for some of those failures. So being able to, and I wonder how our schools can contribute and sort of right that ship where people are being, that we're helping our students develop that skill and ability, and ways in which we can talk about and cognitively disagree, but not necessarily take it as a personal attack and that kind of thing. But it does. So one of the things that the ways that you talked about that was, it's very, very much a sort of cognitive coaching perspective, inquiry stance, paraphrasing and leading through questions, which is one of the things that we want to get our teachers to do a better job of, is how do we call it pull teaching. How do I pull thinking from students in a way that how do I use questions and inquiry to pull thinking from them as sort of pushing information at them and sort of being top down or teacher centered. And I think that there's that dynamic as well with our staff and PLCs and leadership. But there's a bit of a difference, because leadership, if I'm leading a school, or if I'm the director of TeachThought PD and we have facilitators, there are some things that I want them to do, whether they agree with it or not, right? So there's a rubber hits the road kind of thing, and we can paraphrase and rephrase and inquiry and all of those things, but at some point, maybe this gets to the likability, right? So, I don't like you very much because you're making me do stuff I don't like, and that's something that all students will experience and all adults will experience. But lessening that friction, I think, is something, certainly a goal to work towards. But like, what do you say when if I'm going to play devil's advocate and say, people say, yeah, that's all well and good, we're paraphrasing and all those things, but I'm a leader and I need to get things done, and
Yeah, absolutely. And and obviously, as we're talking here, it just reminds me once again of the complexities of leadership, that there is no, one answer here or there. As you were talking there, one of the things that came to my mind in this complexity of leadership and as humans, right? Whether that's as a school leader or a classroom leader, a teacher is a leader of their classroom, or in the family, we all have leadership opportunities in our family, engaging with our kids or our spouses or our brothers or sisters or our parents or whatever, right? So one of the strategies or tools, if you will, I think is really important for us as leaders in whatever situation we're in, is to be clear about, what am I asking? And there's 4 different levels of decision making. Like, let's be clear about decision making processes up front. Like, let's not make it up. Let's not surprise people. Like, if I'm working with a group of principals and we're having a conversation about something, it behooves me as the leader to be clear up front. Is it 4 different levels? Number 1, we're going to make this decision together, and I'm just a member of the team. That's it. Number 2, you're going to make a recommendation to me, and I'm going to weigh your recommendation heavily, but it's still my decision. Number 3, you're going to inform me. I'm not asking for a recommendation. I just want your thinking and information. I'm going to make the decision, and we're going to go this way or that way, but I want to hear your thinking. Or number 4, it's my decision. I don't know what you're thinking. I don't care what you're thinking. This is my decision, right? And these are the 4 levels of decision making that I think all of us need to be clear on, especially when we're in designated leadership positions, because it's unfair. And I think what you're talking about is when we get into situations where people think that we're making this decision together, but we're not. And so I think if we are, as leaders, and again, any of those situations, in a classroom with kids, if I communicate with the kids that we're making a decision together, but it's really my decision, that's on me as a leader. To the fallout from that is on me, right? I need to make sure that I'm clear with folks up front. And so, as an employer, I hire people, right? I mean, when I was in a central office role or a building principal role, I was the employer, right? I hired people. It is my prerogative as the principal, as the director of learning, as the executive director of elementary education, to make certain decisions. And then people follow them out. And there's these 4 levels of decision making that I need to be clear about up front, because too many times we flip-flop back and forth, and that's not fair. And it creates unnecessary conflict, not just cognitive conflict, affective conflict, and it destroys relationships and trust.
Yeah. So I'm remembering and reflecting back on, and I like those distinctions you've made of some of the levels and being clear about that, right? So I had a principal once, and I've told this story in the podcast before, and likable guy and had some charisma as well. And certainly I don't want to badmouth him for anybody who's listening who might have been in a colleague of mine, but yeah, I remember he came in to a staff meeting and said something to the effect of, and most of this language, especially the most divisive language that I'm going to share here was what he said. I don't know if I'll get it exactly right, but he said something like, that we're going to do this and this and this, and I expect you to be on board and go along with this, and if not, we're going to hammer you like hell. And he said, "Hammer you like hell," and he's like, "Well, that's a PLC right there, right?"
Yeah.
But I also have seen and experienced, and hopefully not done this myself, but the cognitive coaching can get into this, where there's a sort of dynamic where you have somebody come in the room, usually in a leadership role, and they say the answers are in this room, and what they really mean is I'm going to let you talk until you say the things I want to hear. Right. Which is a bit manipulative, right? And
yes,
so there is a piece of how you do this artfully and well, and help them make meaning of things and bring them along. One of the things that I think is an important distinction here is, and I am a big fan of, as I said, inquiry. So as leaders and administrators, or whatever, however you want to label them, is asking the right questions. So how do you pose the questions in ways that will help them come to or sort of travel that cognitive path that you are hoping that they will? That's what we want to do with students in project-based learning, for example. And again, it's a bit different. And how you, I know you have some writing or some thoughts on adult learning, so maybe this is a good segue into thinking about that. But sort of how do you lead through inquiry? Part of that is by asking the right question, but there's also the risk there that it may go in a different direction than you like, and so that's a skill as well. And there's some risk there and danger, but there's also, I think, a misnomer or a misunderstanding that if you are leading through inquiry and leading in that way, that you aren't really exercising power. And I would argue the opposite, that you're actually democratizing your staff, and really that is a powerful tool. But again, you have to know how to ask those right questions.
Yeah, I think what you just described there of principal or superintendent, whoever, just working folks until they come to the answer that they want, manipulating folks. I think we see that more often than we should. And I think that's because we're not clear about the 4 levels of decision making. And we can't change it, right? Like if I tell people this is our decision, then as a designated leader, I need to make sure that I'm willing to do whatever we as a group decide, right? And I would also just throw in, just as an aside, that 4th level of I'm just going to make the decision, I don't want your input or anything, it has to be pretty darn rare. And in my experience, comes into play in emergency situations where there's a bomb scare or a fire. I'm not going to gather the staff and ask for your feedback about where we're going. I'm making a decision, and we're going here or there. And so I think that's really critical, is to make sure that we're clear about the levels of decision making, and not manipulating folks into that. In terms of this idea of democratizing, I'm not sure exactly what the word would be, but the work, Linda Lambert, back in the 90s, identified 5 different ideas of building leadership capacity. And one of the things that I loved about her work, it's pretty short and simple, her books, but there's a lot to them. I mean, they're short, but they're meaty. There's a lot to think about. And one of her principles of leadership is that everyone has the right and the responsibility as a leader. And that related to that, leadership is not trait theory. Like typically we think leadership is, and then these are the traits that are associated with leadership. Rather, like she says, leadership is a right and a responsibility. Every single person in the organization has a right and a responsibility to serve as a leader. So you've heard me use the term designated leader periodically, because there are certain people who are designated leaders, right? For this learning team, there's a designated leader. For this school, there's a designated leader. And everyone in the team, in the school, has the right and responsibility to see for his leadership. And I'll take that one step further. Andy Hargraves and Dean Fink wrote a book about sustainable leadership, 10 or 15 years ago. And one of the things they talk about is that if we don't distribute leadership in meaningful ways, it will distribute itself. And they gave the example, and I love this example, that, for example, if we're not distributing leadership amongst our staff regarding a number of things, one thing that could rear itself is a grievance to the union. Somebody's going to grieve it, right? I mean, anybody who's been in a district knows that the Education Association it can be a venue for grievances. And if I'm not happy with something and I'm not able to express myself, then I'm going to find a way to express myself. And that expression will find itself in unwanted and unhelpful ways. For example, it may work its way through the Education Association, through to the school board, people can get fired, all these different things, all because I didn't recognize the truth of the idea that everybody has leadership skills and potential, and they have the right and responsibility to exercise those. My job as a leader is to facilitate that, is to structure that, to give voice to the voiceless, if you will, to make sure that we're able to have that democratized culture, that community in our professional learning community.
So the adult learning principles, what are some of the distinctions there?
Yeah, so that's one of the principles from the book, is this idea of principles of adult learning. And there's a few things that I talk about in there. One is this idea that external trainings are of very limited usefulness. You earlier said, the answers are in the room. Yes. And the job of the designated leaders are to access that learning and expertise, because these external trainings, while they have limited, they are useful, but they're limited usefulness. The challenge is to access what we already know. I like to think of professional learning being sustained, job embedded, collaborative, as part of our work, our daily work, supplemented by what I like to call instructional grenades. That every once in a while, a school and a district is going to toss in these instructional grenades into the environment to help. The grenade's not the exactly right term, but it gives you the idea of lobbing in periodically and strategically. For instance, if we're focused on literacy practices, and the district wants to make sure that we're having certain, for instance, the gradual release model. Well, we're going to need to. Probably most people don't know. If I just say gradual release model, there's going to be people in the school that don't know what that means, and they're not going to know the intricacies of that. So we are going to need some specific instructional hand grenades around the gradual release model. Once we have that, then the challenge is accessing our prior knowledge and expertise to make sure that that's actually happening in the classroom. And so that's one of those principles of adult learning, is that external trainings are of limited usefulness. What we've got to do is really access our internal expertise. A second big idea of the principles of adult learning really comes around this idea of the knowledge worker. I think it was Peter Drucker talked about the knowledge worker. And that's what educators are, right? We're not doing widgets all day long, where I go in a factory and I plug holes all day long and then I go home. Rather, ours is the task of knowledge worker. And there's three characteristics of knowledge workers. One is, those three are autonomy, complexity, and having a connection between effort and reward. And so in terms of adult learning, we as designated leaders need to be thinking about how are we fulfilling these three principles of the knowledge worker. So autonomy doesn't mean I just get to do whatever I want, but that I have a value in my own expertise, that others recognize and access that internal expertise. In terms of complexity, that we as leaders aren't in a checklist mode. And I'm not saying checklists don't have a place. They do. I'm a firm believer in checklists. And the work of teaching and learning is so incredibly complex. And we have to recognize that and understand that. And so in my opinion, mandates for specific instructional practices should be few and far between, because what works for one kid doesn't work for another. What works for one group of kids doesn't work for another. What works for one teacher doesn't work for another. I love the work of John Hattie, as your listeners probably know well. And I love how he comes out and he says, my work has been so misunderstood. It's not about do number one, don't do number two. The big idea of his work is that everything works and nothing works. That's what his research says. It's not about choosing this or that and then doing it. It's a matter of being thoughtful, us as educators being reflective in our practice, and to, I love his term, know thy impact. And so the work of teaching and learning is so incredibly complex, and we have to understand and recognize and value that complexity as designated leaders. And then the third big idea of a knowledge worker is that there's a connection between effort and reward. And in education, that's not, or I would contend in any field, it's not really monetarily. It's in the value that we see in our work and the impact that we see on our work. And so the use of data or evidence to help us see that when I do X, I get Y, or Y and Z. And so there's this connection between what I'm doing and the results that we're seeing. So that's kind of the second big idea of adult learning. So first is external trainings are limited usefulness. Second is these three ideas around a knowledge worker. And then the third big idea of adult learning comes from Learning Forward and the standards of professional learning. And there's some specific learning designs that Lois Easton and some others identified that said, these are some specific strategies, tools, and protocols that can be very helpful in building professional learning. And basically it comes down to we're doing the work together. Kind of goes back to those first two ideas. But there's some structures and processes to make sure that we are, as adults, valuing our expertise, accessing that expertise, and then using it to get better.
So now you've got me all insecure about external professional development, because that's what we do, right?
Right, and I'm a consultant, right? So
yeah. So I guess the important question here is, to the extent that you understand or have thoughts about it, what are the ways in which, because you said limited, so that means that there's some value, and I would assume that some are more valuable than others, certainly my experience as a teacher, and hopefully my experience as a professional development provider. One, are there specific things that you can share that make external professional development more valuable and not falling into that larger category? But also maybe how might that fit into the work of PLCs specifically? Because I do think that there's a reasonable and useful connection.
Yeah. So how do we make sure that the external trainings are useful and then related to the PLCs? Yeah. So I think when I think of making sure that those external trainings are useful, I think of two things. Because you're right. I just recently became a consultant, and so here I am, trying to sell my wares, if you will, and at the same time as saying, wait a second, folks, this is very limited usefulness, and it is. Now, I think the key word is it's limited. That doesn't mean that there's not usefulness. It's just we got to be strategic about it. And so there's two big ideas that come to my mind. First is alignment, alignment, alignment. I think too many times in schools, we have our strategic plan. Hopefully we have our strategic plans, but then our professional development doesn't necessarily align with those strategic plans. And our work in our PLCs doesn't align with that. And our individual personal practice plans that we have, as part of our growth plans every year don't align with that. And so that's ineffective, right? I mean, it's like trying to drive down a street that all these streets or all the cars are going different ways, right? It doesn't work. So I'm a fan of having alignment from the boardroom to the classroom. Although I don't necessarily think it happens in that order. It doesn't start with the board. It needs to come up from the classroom. Like, what are the needs that we're seeing in the classroom that then are needs that schools have, that then are needs that the district has, that the board then sets that strategic direction. So having that alignment. So if as a district, we have a strategic plan and schools have plans aligned with that, and learning teams have their work focused on that, and individual teachers, then we can make sure that our professional learning is also tied into that. So that's the first thing I think about. The second thing is this idea of, when we have the external trainings, are they sit and gets, or are they focused on building capacity? And it's typically sit and gets are, one-time wonders, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody comes in, a fly-by workshop, right? Or drive-by workshop.
Right.
And that doesn't cut it. And I think it behooves us as school and district leaders to make sure that we are aligned, and that we're not just saying, yep, Chad went to a conference. Guess what? He's going to be bringing a speaker next month because of that. Or guess what? Next summer speakers from... And I'm not downplaying conferences. I'm not downplaying those speakers. They're absolutely critical and they're important. And when we bring those folks in, they need to be aligned to the work that we're doing and focused on building the capacity of folks. My focus as a consultant is to put myself out of business. I want to build your capacity to do the work so that you don't have to call on me, because I don't want you to call. I want you to be able to do the work. And you to be able to access your own expertise and apply that expertise.
Yeah, so you've hit on some of the things that we do try to do, and there's a blog piece that I have that is sort of tongue-in-cheek, how to not make professional development pointless, or how to avoid pointless professional development. And I actually we use an alignment and refinement cycle that is, and I think I do, and if I don't, I should revisit and make sure I do, use and draw on the work of Richard DeVore, and clarifying that purpose and mission. And we take that a little further and say, let's turn that into a mission question and engage in the inquiry and project-based learning kind of process. But then what's the vision? And make sure that we're all sure and clear on what we're trying to accomplish, so that we're all pulling in the same direction, and that there's clarity around that. Even so far as, again, we in our project-based learning work we really emphasize, especially when creating your project and your driving question of clarifying product, purpose, and audience. And that's very closely related. And then a third step is to say, all right, let's now that we've clarified our mission and vision and that purpose, let's make sure that we are aligning all of our actions to meet those. And then sort of a fourth, I don't like that it's a fourth step, because it's really sort of an overlay that we're continually doing in the process, is really critiquing and saying, in what ways was that effective or ineffective, and how do we do that better, and that kind of thing. So I think that, and much like you said, so how do we work ourselves out of a job? I was talking with the head of school in Maryland just this morning about doing some work, and I said, what we hope to do is build some of that internal capacity, so that we don't have to keep coming back as much as we would like to keep coming back. financially it benefits us, but
Right.
what we hope to do is to build that internal capacity so that you are doing that. We do that, and lesson study is another sort of version of that. It's that collaborative work. The unfortunate reality is that we, as professional development providers, are not always and often not in control of whether it's one time or not. I mean, certainly we could say, unless we do it over a number of years, then we won't do it at all. That's a pretty unsustainable model in a number of ways. We hope to engage schools in a way that will be of value, and they say we want to do more, and that does happen quite often. But there are so many schools and leaders who are, I get calls and emails all the time saying, hey, we've got a professional development day on June 13th. Can you help us? Can you do 2 hours? We can, but I don't think that's really, particularly helpful in the long term. But, we also have a crisis or maybe not a crisis, maybe a crisis of sort of solid leadership. And I'm wondering too, again, kind of getting at some of the characteristics of good leadership. Is there a role for leadership, do you think, from folks that are not necessarily haven't been good teachers or even haven't been teachers? I know that's sort of heresy to even suggest that. That was one of the big criticisms of Betsy DeVos, and I think there's some teeth to that. But there's also a weird dynamic of not necessarily do the best teachers make best leaders, or teachers in general. Is that really a good place to harvest, or the best place, or the only place to harvest leadership?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to think about. I know that some of the best principals I've worked with were also some of the best teachers. Mm-hmm. I also know some principals who are pretty darn effective principals, that they weren't the best of teachers. They were okay. So I don't know if it necessary, and somebody else might say, no, Chad, you're way off your mark. That's okay. I could be. I'm just talking about some of the principals I worked with. I'm thinking of one principal in particular who is really effective. His or her school and the staff in that school, their ability to build a sense of team. You talk about having the C in PLC, the sense of team, the sense of using data to get better, we're all in this together, we're achieving results. The kids in the school, it's a highly diverse school. It wasn't always a highly diverse school. It actually was the result of a merger, and went from being fairly high socioeconomic status kids to a mix of really wealthy and real poor kids. And yet he or she, I'm specifically being vague for that reason, has done an incredible job of that school, where the kids are welcome and safe, and the parents love it, and the teachers are happy, and the teachers are doing great work, and the student achievement is improving. All of the characteristics of an amazing school. Who I never remember seeing this person ever teach, but from the reputation was that they were an okay teacher. And I guess that just kind of gets to me as a person. I don't like to pigeonhole people, because I think on this particular individual's case, had the criteria been you've got to be an amazing teacher, that district would have really missed out on a fantastic principal. Now, maybe there would have been another fantastic principal in the wings. I don't know, that would have been better. I doubt it. Now, that's not to say that we should always do that, but I don't personally like to pigeonhole saying, hey, in order to be a great principal, you have to have been a great teacher. I think it helps. I've also seen amazing principals who were fantastic teachers. Mm-hmm. Really good.
Yeah, it kind of gets to kind of how you framed or talked about Hattie's work, is that everything works and nothing works, and there is no hard and fast rule. Is it possible for somebody just to have a few years of teaching experience or none and be an effective principal or school leader? It's certainly possible. Is it likely? Probably less likely than somebody who has more experience and can draw on that expertise and wisdom. but the opposite is not an absolute either.
Right.
It is a difficult position. My mom was a principal. She was my teacher, and then ended up being a principal in a few schools. And she tried to get me to be a principal, and I said, "You're out of your mind. That seems like one of the worst jobs in the world." Everybody, first of all, everybody thinks that you have all this autonomy and authority and you can just, do this, do this, do this, where in reality, you've got a board, you've got superintendent, you've got, various levels, and everybody is pointing at you as the person that's supposed to be doing things. The students, the parents, the board, the superintendent, all of the other leaders. It's a somewhat thankless job. I don't think that's anything that I would. I don't envy, and I certainly empathize with. So it's a tough job.
And I think I would add, we need great teachers. We need amazing teachers, and we need great teams of teachers who are supporting and helping each other get better. And I'm just going to throw this out there as well. We need to pay our teachers better. I think that they are, especially during these times where we've got COVID and equity issues, and the gaps are just going to get bigger with this at-home learning. I think as a society, we need to recognize and value and put our money where our mouth is to make sure that we have the best teachers in the classroom for our future generations.
Yeah, we definitely need to reward them better and reward excellence better. And I'm not saying that as an endorsement or a promotion of merit pay, because I don't necessarily think that. But I also think that we need to make it easier for teachers to do great work. And I think PLCs are a key to that. So as we're coming to the end of the time, are there some things a little bit more granular level suggestions that you might share with folks who might be listening, leaders, and thinking about PLCs and how you might structure them, set them up, how often, expectations, sort of nuts and bolts kinds of things?
Yeah, lots of nuts and bolts that could be filled in. I'm guessing, you mentioned Rick DeFore earlier. He's got lots of, God rest his soul and his wife's soul and the work that they did, and continue, his legacy continues with all of the specific details and such. Maybe I'll just, and they talk about, collaborative time and frequency and those types of things. Maybe I'll just add a couple of things that may be helpful for school leaders and teachers. I think one of the reasons why PLCs have such a bad name, as I mentioned earlier, is because when we get to these meetings, they're ineffective. And then what happens is then the school leader says, okay, we got to make them effective. So therefore you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And by golly, you better have this assignment to me by this day or that assignment to that day. Mm-hmm. And so, and that can work, and I've seen it work, and can be highly successful over time if we also have the intention of making sure that we're building community. The other thing I would add that can be more of a like a ground up, like from teachers up, like if I know that my team's not effective, what can I do to make this more effective? There was an amazing study by Google that came out just a couple of years ago, where they looked at teams and what were the most effective characteristics of teams. And they studied, I think, 200 teams at Google. So you're talking, 3,000 people, something like that. And what they found is that effective teams had two characteristics that and it was across all of the effective teams. And whenever I share this with folks, I share how, typically we think that, an effective team is people like each other. No, that wasn't one of the characteristics. People have good food and snacks, and I'm a big believer in food and snacks, and I think that's helpful, but that's not a common characteristic of effective teams. Sometimes they say that people are they know their stuff, like they're experts. Like if I'm on a team and I'm a social studies person and a reading person, then they're experts of their stuff. Nope, that also didn't matter. The most effective teams had two characteristics, and those two characteristics were, number one, the degree to which we read each other's social emotional cues. facial expressions, tone of voice, head movement and arm movement, body language, these body language things, the extent to which we read each other's body language and respond accordingly. And the second thing, and this is so very simple and can solve a whole heck of a lot of problems, equity of turn taking. So if I'm on a team and we're struggling, or even if we're not struggling, we want to get better. As a team and as individuals within the thing, thinking about those two things. First of all, how can we build up our ability to read and respond appropriately to each other's social, emotional, nonverbal cues? Number one. And number two, how can we make sure that we get everybody's voices in the room, that it's not dominated by one person or another, and that another person or another never say anything? So I guess those would be kind of like in my experience with teams, like there's a lot of things you could talk about. Is time of the day, how often, how large of groups, who's in those groups, and those are all important things. And I think the other thing is that all those other ideas, there's other people who talk about that a lot. One thing we have not talked about is helping a team become effective, equity of turn taking, and social emotional nonverbal cues and responding appropriately to those cues, which gets back to what we talked about very early on: pausing, paraphrasing, posing questions, being in dialogue, etc.
Right. And so there's a couple things there that I think are important in that work and sort of trying to do those things. One of those is the at least occasional, and they can be too frequent, but use of protocols that can allow for some of those space and ways in which people can think and get their voice heard and allow space for others. But then also rubrics and effective rubrics, so that we know that what we're talking about when we're giving feedback and providing and critiquing something, whether it's somebody's shared work or a student's work or whatever it might be, that we have a lens of quality. And we talk about being drawing on the work of Ron Berger, kind, specific, and helpful, and you have to be specific, and that helps create some of that culture around talking about the work, not talking about a person, and shifting that culture where you are kind of getting at that maybe cognitive conflict, if that might surface there as opposed to affective piece. So, if you have any thoughts about protocols or any of those kinds of things, that would be a great time to share that. But I also want to give you an opportunity to share any web links and things like that, and anything that we didn't talk about. Yeah.
Well, in terms of protocols, yes, I think they're really powerful and important, and I like to simplify things. I'm a believer in kissing things. Keep it simple, Sally. And so I think protocol is simple.
Sally, I'd never heard that one. It's a more positive spin than I usually use. And they're usually talking about me.
So do they say keep it simple, silly? Is that what they say?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. Okay. So protocols are simply step-by-step procedures. Like it's nothing more than that. And so I think having protocols in place are really important for teams to become more effective. Is teams who are ineffective find them really helpful to get better, and then teams that are already effective, it just amplifies their work. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I think like you said, protocols maybe are overused sometimes, and I would put a slightly different twist on that. In addition to that they are also inappropriately or poorly used.
Yes.
In times, and so because of that, then maybe the overuse definitely feels more overused.
Yeah.
So anyway, protocols are so very important to improve our effectiveness.
Sorry to interrupt you, but just to sort of piggyback on that. So as a teacher, I tell this story because we use protocols and we do some collaboration and partnership with National School Reform faculty folks, and they have some great work. I mean, that's what they do is protocols. So I definitely recommend listeners check out National School Reform faculty. But I remember doing, some sort of protocol, and it was done poorly. And I'm fairly cynical and curmudgeonly sometimes. I'm cuddly as a cactus. I like to say sometimes is, I had somebody trying to facilitate this. I can't remember. We were, evaluating or critiquing some student work or something, or teacher work. I'm not exactly sure. But the point being that the facilitator, and this was somebody inside the school district and at administration leadership level, she said, all right, you have 2 minutes to say good things. And there was no rubric. There was no lens of quality. I mean, you could sort of guess at what it might be, but at that point there wasn't any common shared language or vision and what we're looking for. And I sort of when I talk about protocols, I sometimes tell this story because I felt kind of like Jim Carrey in Dumb and Dumber. I like it a lot, I don't know what to say here, right?
Right.
So if we're going to do protocols, if you're going to do PLCs, if you're going to do these things, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. And if you're not doing protocols well, if you're not doing PLCs well, it can turn into a negative experience. And just like many things, we don't want to do it poorly. So how do we do it well? So that might be a good segue into your book and getting folks to recognize and or find it in that kind of place or those kinds of things, and where they might find you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is called Let's Put the C in PLC, a practical guide for school leaders. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and a couple of other like Powell's and some independent bookstore. So if folks prefer not to go to the big dogs like Amazon or Barnes & Noble, they can go to Powell's and bookstore.com, I think. But all of that information is available on my website, which is nextlearningsolutions.com. And people can also get to me through Twitter, which is, I evidently got on Twitter early enough that I don't have any number or anything in my name. It's just at Chad Dumas, ChadDumas. And that also has links to my website, www.nextlearningsolutions.com, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. But at Chad Dumas on Twitter is probably the simplest, easiest way.
All right, great. And I often like to say Apple and iTunes doesn't allow for us to live link. So if you are looking for the links themselves and want to just click on them instead of try to search in Google or whatever, you'll have to go to the show notes on either TeachThought.com or WeGrowTeachers.com. So, Chad, thanks so much for your time and the work on what I think is a really important and powerful piece in school culture and development and improving teaching and learning when done well. And again, thanks so much for the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so very much for having me on.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.